Hudson River fishermen, their philosophy was, we're going to stop the baloney. If we find the polluter, we're going to sue them for all they're worth. And these were a bunch of tough guys. You know, they were grizzled men. Some of them were scientists. Some of them were people that worked on the river, tugboat guys. But they decided they would stop at nothing to clean up the river. So we're going to talk about daylighting, you know, how we decided to bring a river that was buried underground, above ground. And when I was a young man, if you came up with that idea, they would say, you're totally nuts. You're insane. What is this idea of bringing rivers above ground? But we had this transformation in society, in the Hudson River Valley, that we viewed rivers as a resource. I'd like to tell one story. In the days of the Hudson River fishermen, in the early days, Exxon, the oil company, would drop off oil in Bayonne, New Jersey, down by New York City. And then they would discharge their bilge water, this toxic mist of chemicals and oil, and discharge it into the Hudson. And then, mysteriously, they would fill their tanks up with fresh Hudson River water. So they would fill up with fresh water. And be damned the people of the Hudson River that they would discharge this toxic mix into the river. And this happened over and over again. And the interesting thing is they were taking the water, Exxon was taking the water back to Aruba, the island of Aruba. And they were using the water in their refineries, and believe it or not, in their swimming pools. So the joke from New York was, if you were swimming in a pool in Aruba, and you felt close to home, you probably were. You were swimming in Hudson River water. You can't make this up. So the riverkeeper, the fishermen, one time they went out with a patrol boat, and they pulled up along this giant Exxon oil tanker, and they went on the marine radio, and they said to the Exxon captain, you know, what are you doing? What are you doing? And I guess if you work for Exxon, there's a certain arrogance. And the captain on the Exxon oil tanker said, and who is this to ask me what I'm doing? Who is this? And John Cronin answered back, I'm a fisherman. I'm a person. This is my river. And to hell with you to be able to pollute this river that belongs to all of us. So the environmental movement on the Hudson started in the 60s and 70s. And we built groups of constituents, all people from all walks of life, that, you know, would rally, would fight, would go up against the government. A lot of times the government was in cahoots with the polluters. But the people rallied, and whether you were a big company or a small company, they would fight to clean it up. So I did different projects. I worked on the boat, the Sojourner. I helped start an environmental education center in Yonkers. And this groundwork Hudson Valley, changing places, changing lives. One day the phone rang down at the environmental center, and the mayor of Yonkers called me up. And he said, we want to start another environmental group, and we need somebody to chair the steering committee. Just to get it off the ground, it shouldn't take long. You know, long is always a relative word. How long is long? So I volunteered to chair the committee, and we started this environmental group, Groundwork Hudson Valley. And the people on the screen there, Anne-Marie Mitra, these gentlemen know, Anne-Marie runs our river programs. Rick Magner is the executive director. And myself, I run the science bunch. So it's interesting, when I chaired the steering committee, You know, I was on the committee that hired Rick, and 6 years ago he called me up and he asked to help out on the project of the science barge. So, but the story is about this daylight. The idea that the Sawmill River, you know, which is viewed in the early days as another sewer, you know, it was another sewer. You know, you could smell it, you could taste it in your mouth when you walk by, but the idea that it was a resource, we couldn't have done that. We couldn't have had that change of attitude unless we cleaned up the main river, the Hudson first. And once we had that cleaned up, we could look at the tributaries. So Groundwork Hudson Valley, we're based in Yonkers, New York. Yonkers is almost a suburb of New York City. If some people know the Bronx, you know, we have Manhattan, the Bronx, and then Yonkers on the Hudson River. So the motto of Groundwork is changing places, changing lives. So the idea of Groundwork is working in partnership. The Clearwater, the Scenic Hudson, the Groundwork principle was working with the government to develop projects. Some of our funding comes from the National Park Service and the Environmental Protection Agency. Groundwork takes a multifaceted approach to what we do. You know, changing places, changing lives, the idea of changing brownfields that were a big topic in the lecture earlier today. We do a lot of brownfield work, changing them into community gardens. Let's see if the pointer is working. The top picture up there is the daylight when it was finished. We do a sawmill farmers market up in the top left. The science captains I respect, you have to be licensed. But the young people that I work with, for whatever reason, they started calling me Captain Bob, and I consider it an honor. So the barge is an interesting project, and you might say, what does it have to do with clean rivers? It's a hydroponic farm. We're growing food in the greenhouses. We grow it hydroponically. We're using solar panels. We have 5 wind turbines. In the background, you'll see the Palisades. Those are the cliffs that are across, you know, from Yonkers and New Jersey. And what's the idea? The idea is being able to show people that we're independent. This is Yonkers in 1784. This house here is important. This house was built in the late 1600s. Yonkers is a Dutch name. It's named after Adrian van der Donk, the young gentleman. And the Phillipses, you know, built that house. So, you know, Brazil has this Dutch connection. Yonkers has a Dutch connection. This is 1845. It's interesting, this dock here is actually where the science barge is now. All this has been filled in. This was all filled in. In 1910, the river has been made into a canal. The sewage is flowing down inside the city. There's flooding. And the idea comes up, similar to Sao Paulo, that the river should be buried. It's not an asset. It's a detriment to the city. So they spent quite a bit of money putting it into a flume. This is the tunnel that we saw earlier. They covered it over, and they made it a part here that the natural world should be incorporated. This project had the fish ladder for when we originally worked on the Sawmill River years ago, they said it's a dead river. This river is dead. But then we went out with high school students with nets, and the river that was dead had 23 species of fish in it. And that in itself, that the river was alive, was part of this transformation that it needed to be preserved. They put that fish ladder in. A week later, the guys that were working on the site, they called up the office. They said, you know that fish ladder that we put in? Guess what's going up in? Fish. This is the exit back into the tunnel out into the Hudson River. So we talked a lot about city engineering, and I'm not an engineer, I'm a river guy. But there was a lot of thought into, incorporating different problems into the park. And it's interesting. This was the original parking lot. Who do you think would be against daylighting a river? What group? It was interesting. The parking lot people that worked here, they were afraid they'd lose their jobs. So, going to the meeting and listening to these gentlemen and women, 6 of them were going to lose their jobs if we put that parking lot away. I knew there had to be a compromise, because we didn't want these 6 individuals to lose their jobs that worked in the parking lot. So, interesting enough, this whole area, do you guys have parking meters in Brazil? I haven't seen any yet. A parking meter was where you put money in, and it gives you 15 minutes or a half an hour to park your car. So what we did in this area, the parking meters, instead of stopping at 6 o'clock, they stopped at 8 o'clock. And the money that was generated in the neighborhood allowed those employees to save their jobs. If you sit and talk, there is a solution, and that was the solution to that. This is some of the engineering. There's the outlet for the water. This was a brownfield, so we had to separate the original fill from the new riverbed. This was the big moment. This was the big moment. And we needed a big crane, so we closed the street at night. The original tunnel that you saw in that picture, we cut out 3 chunks of the channel to be able to divert the water into the new stream. Where'd the money come from? That's always a question. Where the heck does the money come from? I mentioned that Hudson River fisherman.